Hi again. Today we are here to begin a new timeline on a popular video game genre that everyone knows today as the first-person shooter, FPS. We finished the RTS timeline in 3 parts. I suggest watching them as they take you on a journey of a genre that was once glorious to now hardly spoken about. Special thanks to everyone that CLS, commented, liked, and/or subscribed. It is really appreciated. The FPS had a similar timeline to that of the RTS, but has had a different, more successful outcome in later years. And now we want to know why and how has the FPS become one of the most dominant video game genres. Just like any story that is told, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Strangely enough, both rival genres had games developed prior to the actual name of the genre created. They both also had the one game which has the blueprint of the genre written all over it, and it has introduced the main principles found in even their present-day games. But every one of these FPS we cover today has discovered an aspect in some shape or form that has led to the genre's success and development, and they are best labeled as the pioneers of the FPS. Beginning our timeline, we have a video game called Ait'sZ that was originally developed by high school students Steve Colley, Greg Thompson, and Howard Palmer in 1973. It is the earliest known prototype FPS that was playable on the IMLAC PDS-1, dubbed a mini-computer at the time that costed over $8,000.
One of the first graphics computers, the vector graphics.
It was only used in non-residential institutes such as research centers, universities, and commercial buildings. So you can imagine that the average person really had no clue this game existed, as its exposure was limited to a certain group of people, such as college students. The game has some primitive FPS features such as first-person view of forward or backward movement and 90-degree rotation of view. The early goal was to find the finish point through the vast maze. Later on, the developers added a shooting ability to battle with other players, and as players succeeded in landing a shot at their foes, points were given, or taken away if you received one.
The bot is right up there, he is, and we're gonna die.
And no doubt we can see that maze is far off from being minutely close to an FPS we are used to today, but the ability to move in a 3D plane, though restricted to certain directions, and firing projectiles at opponents, shows us that very early stages of an FPS. And the reason is very obvious as to why this game did not have success was none other than the lack of exposure to the average gamers, who were mostly children and teenagers at the time. And we can argue that the technology of computers was still new and most people had no idea how they functioned yet, as another factor of its unrecognized fate. Fast forwarding to 1980, we have another FPS that was released in a slightly more conventional method, consoled on an arcade cabinet, and has made awareness across arcades around the US and Japan mainly. Battlezone was developed by Atari Inc. Yes, the same popular developers in the 70s and 80s as the console with the same name. It has a player in a first-person view as a tank that can maneuver in 360-degree direction, much improved to Maze War. The movement was much more smooth also because the graphics were in a 3D vector plane. They were still monochrome, but it was an improvement when seeing a tank explode into pieces. Difficulty also rose slightly as you had to maneuver through the obstacles found on the ground, all while dodging the enemy tank projectiles. The added sound, though still very basic, also helped with the perception of actually being on the battlefield. A radar was present to help in revealing enemy locations. Newly introduced AI who controlled the spawned enemy tanks is also a step further to the FPS picture. There were different enemies as the difficulty rose. In the beginning it was slower enemy tanks, then it became faster giant missiles that were difficult to dodge, and finally in the later stages there were the more aggressive and intelligent tanks. We see these unit adjustments quite often in FPS as you progress through the different levels of the game, keeping the players challenged and engaged. While Maze had some improvements in graphics and gameplay, the FPS genre still needed a lot of work to even catch the eye of gamers. The method of game consumption has slowly adapted to have gamers switch to playing in the comfort of their own home, instead of constantly having to go out to an arcade to enjoy. In the 90s, computers were much more commonly found in a household. Though the computer operating system used at the time, DOS, is not found in present-day computers, it was commonly found on computers throughout the late 80s and mid-90s. And the next FPS was developed to run on DOS. Catacombs 3D 1991 was developed by Ait'sZ Software, a very instrumental developer of the FPS picture in the 90s, and we are going to hear their name a lot in this timeline. In this FPS, you play as a wizard that must find his friend from an evil lich inside a catacomb with many levels to go through and different types of monsters to kill. The lich is the final boss you face, who is unique and the strongest enemy. the movement still being basic as you must turn using the left and right keys, and the up and down are for the forward and backward movement. It can also become very annoying when you are being attacked from behind and it takes a few seconds to turn towards the enemy to retaliate. But nothing to worry about, as the game has added collectible items such as potions, which are obtained at no capacity limit, and they are abundant. They will heal you back to full health, which brings me to my next point. The game's difficulty level is really easy on the normal mode, and part of it is this reason. We can see the introduction of special moves in this game that are recharged as collectibles. The moves are called Bolt, which temporarily releases a series of fireballs in rapid succession, and the Nuke launches a horizontal spread shot of fireballs. And we have to mention the big improvement of visuals, finally introducing color. I mean, it is a decade later, so it is expected by now. Music is introduced, but still a work in progress for the FPS timeline, as it has only one looping track that becomes really annoying. Another shortcoming to bring up is the lack of a map. You do have a compass, which not sure if that helps all that much, so be prepared to travel in circles and endure the inevitable frustration of being lost. Clearly we can see this game has not aged well, but we are still in the early stages of the timeline, and it is satisfying to see even the slightest improvements and additions such as the FPS interface with all the status and inventory indicators. Only a year later, it has introduced another FPS called Wolfenstein 3D, using an improved version of Catacombs game engine. In this series, you are a captured US-Polish spy who attempts to escape Castle Wolfenstein to foil the Nazi attempts of world domination during World War II. This is likely an FPS you recognize, and probably would have thought of as the first known FPS. And part of that reason is that we can see these 5 main principles introduced that are seen in most FPS games until today. Playing in a first-person perspective with a visible weapon on hand, free movement in 3D space, an arsenal of weapons to find and use at your disposal, collectibles to aid on the journey such as ammo and health packs, and lastly the ability to cover while attacking. It has been often labeled as the blueprint game of the FPS, equivalent to Dune 2 for the RTS. The most substantial advancement from Catacombs 3D and the other FPS has to be the difficulty level. Let's go through some of the factors that directly cause this. First and most importantly, the AI intelligence has improved, because they will sense when you have made noise in another room and investigate. The other smart ability is that they will not fall for your traps to lure them to come out of the door and shoot them as they open. In fact, the AI will attempt the same technique on you, and the second you open the door, they will shoot you before you can even react to move out of the way. It is possible that this may be unintentional, and could be that the AI is just struggling to figure out how to get through the door, but it still adds to the challenge. Make sure you keep your distance and take cover, as the closer the enemy lands their shots, the higher the damage. Another difficulty raising factor is that projectiles are not shown traveling in space and are instant, making it almost impossible to dodge a shot from the enemy, who are not easily detected and could approach you on your blind sides. Most enemies present in the game of different tier levels are ranged attackers, raising the difficulty from mostly melee monsters and catacombs. An ammo system has been introduced, and this secretly can cause agony if you are not efficient in using them, as attacking with a knife is meant for last resort, and you know what they say, never bring a knife to a gunfight. On top of all the collectibles, ammo and health packs are scarce and have a capacity limit, so a lot of times you may need to return to the uncollected items as it will be needed in the future. Which brings me to the next point regarding the rise of difficulty. A map is still not present, so be prepared to put your memory to test, or else you will be frustrated when you constantly repeat areas of the level. The sounds have become digitized audio. This is noticed when the guards shout when alerted, and the sounds coming from gunshots are much more realistic. The music is still Sound Blaster quality, but now has multiple tracks to change the mood. Make no mistake, the majority of these changes point the development to the right direction, despite causing some degree of anger, but as you can tell, there are still some dire improvements to be made. And again, only a year later from Wolfenstein, Ait'sZ's next published game will take the FPS picture into a whole new level. Doom hit the market and was developed using the same game engine as both Catacombs 3D and Wolfenstein. But why has Doom had more success and is renowned as the best of the early FPS? It is all about refinement and fixing any gameplay issues. And I have mentioned this before in the RTS timeline, and I will always revert to the Age of Empires 1 to Age of Empires 2 development example, which is a similar case here between Doom and Wolfenstein. first we will begin by going over the few but important FPS aspects that Doom has added, beginning with the usage of a map. How simple this addition is, yet can greatly ease the mind of gamers to avoid being stuck in a loop of insanity when becoming lost. On top of looking at the map, you are able to move your character, although only in the top-down view of the map that lacks the location of the enemy, meaning you can be attacked without knowing while looking at the map. Still saves you a lot of time and can help pinpoint secret areas that are common but hard to find in these pioneer FPS. Next new addition is the armor. It does not quite act as another layer of HP. It is more of a resistance to the hits you endure. In other words, you can die with still having armor present. Including this feature allows for life longevity and has reduced the difficulty, whereas in Wolfenstein, 2 to 3 close range hits can swiftly terminate your run. Now let's move on to the improvements and adjustments, which is a pinpoint of emphasis on Doom's success. Starting off with the expanded array of weapons that are more unique. There are a total of 8. I won't go through all of them, but I will show you a few examples and explain their main purpose. The shotgun is the main go-to weapon with medium to high damage depending on the distance, and it fires at a slower rate. Chain gun is the fast-firing light damage gun that is great to use against heavier demons, as it momentarily stuns them from moving or attacking each time the shot is landed. The chainsaw is a melee weapon with one of the highest damage per second, but it presents a risk to you as you will need to approach the enemy as close as possible. We also have to bring up the increased enemies and how each pose a different threat. Example, the specters, who are partially invisible, make them extremely hard to see in not well lit areas and thrive on surprise attacks against you. Just to touch on the enemies further, their presence overall has multiplied from Wolfenstein, and it is essential to shift locations frequently to find shelter. This may have added to the difficulty, but it really does maximize the brain activity and thrill with all the chaos that occurs. The variety of power-up items that almost all have a duration when picked up have been expanded, and maybe we can argue that Catacombs 3D bolts and nuke pickups were more of another type of ammunition rather than power-ups, thus making it more of an introduction in Doom. Examples of power-ups are the Berserk Pack, which allows for 10 times fist damage throughout the whole level, and an invulnerability artifact which immunizes you from any damage taken for 30 seconds. The graphics have improved in just a year. The sprites are still 2D, but they are much detailed, and you can tell they have used 3D clay models to digitize them. We now have height levels that we can traverse through using stairs or lift. Sound effects are more clear, and when the monsters give out their cry, you can instantly tell which type of enemy it is. And one of my favorite improvements was the music. On top of having the creepy ambient music, it has added more metal, upbeat music that paired well when fighting swarms of monsters. With having a lot of success with their Doom title, id published the next game but put their trust in another developer they discovered to have a common passion for gameplay development, Raven Software. Heretic is set in this dark fantasy world where you play as an elf that ventures out to defeat one of the 3 serpent riders who have corrupted the world of Partherus. Equivalent to Doom's gameplay, there are an array of monsters to kill and weapons with different purposes to aid you through the levels. Despite using the Doom engine, there are a few differences to note. You can use the keys to either look up or down, but this has many constraints as it's slow to move the camera view back and forth, and you might as well stick with the auto-aim firing that already existed in Doom. The ability to collect power-up items in an inventory and use them freely at any time was a small but appreciated feature. This feature works well with the Wings of Wrath, which allows for flight for a short period of time, also another enhancement that has been improved from the Doom engine. All in all, a very decent game that fulfilled gamers' craving of Doom with a completely different fantasy theme. Raven would go on to continue the Heretic series with some direct and indirect sequels. A year later, we have an FPS that finally has been produced by a team not called Ait'sZ Software. Descent, developed by Parallax Software and published by Interplay Productions, is a first-person pilot spaceship shooter that has you seek and destroy a foreign virus which has infected spaceships and robots within the research mines that were used to harvest resources within the planets they reside. Identical to an FPS, but also the same idea as the 2D shooters, the goal is to collect as many upgrades to both your primary and secondary weapons to help you easily progress through the level. What is very underrated about this game is that it's one of the first fully 3D games released. The enemies and surrounding objects within the environment are formed using 100% 3D polygons. Though the visuals are very pixelated with low resolution, and this is to no surprise as we are on the primitive stage of true 3D. The map was unique as it was shown in a 3D diagram and was really useful as it portrayed levels of altitude. Another new and critical feature to the FPS picture was the ability to aim using the mouse in all 4 directions, called free look. Past RTS we covered, the aiming was done automatically so long as it was within the view of the weapon. It was very frustrating at times when the auto aim would not lock onto the enemy, and you would waste ammo firing towards no one. I will say, you will need to switch around the keys, as on default the movement works in a thrusting motion, where the mouse turns the direction of the ship and the A key is held down for acceleration. It is not ideal for dodging enemy projectiles, especially when the mouse sensitivity is not reactive, causing the turning to be slow. But there are keys for strafing that will make the entire ship shift in all 4 directions quicker. It just needs to be reconfigured. The music was influenced by electronic bands, and I felt the type of music suits the FPS very well. The one issue was that it was played as a MIDI soundtrack and the quality sound varied from the type of sound card present in your computer. The multiplayer through LAN was conveniently set up to add up to 8 players at any point and did not need players to wait in queue before the deathmatch or co-op began. Despite a few setbacks with movement mechanics, this FPS will keep you occupied and glued to your chair with all the inevitable chaos coming from the enemy ships attacking in all directions. 2 years now have passed, and this will be a big jump the FPS will have in terms of overall mechanics in this era. 2 memorable games were released in 1996, and the first one we will discuss is called Duke Nukem 3D, developed by 3D Realms, formerly known as Apogee prior to 1996, and published by FormGen. The Duke Nukem series was known for having 2 successful 2D platformers earlier in the 90s. But how would 3D Realms fare with developing its first FPS in comparison to id, who by now you are thinking has had a monopoly over this genre? And it was highly successful, both commercially and critically. An aspect that was expanded on was the ability to use and stop usage at will of collected power-up items, which they now possess a durability percentage meter. This would increase the longevity of the item by being able to use it when needed most. One most notable item benefiting from this was the scuba gear, which allowed for underwater swimming without the need to pull up for oxygen. There are other minor FPS additions that I won't get into too much detail with, but I will quickly mention the weapon reload, the sensor traps, the shrink ray weapon to instant kill, and the pipe bomb, which is remotely detonated at your command. Just to note that jumping and crouching for the FPS was introduced by a game that I'm not covering on this timeline, called Star Wars Dark Forces in 1995, as it was very similar to Doom aside from the one new feature. The music was enjoyable, but I wish it did not switch to low ambience too often. Despite still utilizing 2D sprites on a 3D plane, they were much more detailed and less pixelated with a higher resolution. Lastly, another changer that did not affect gameplay but elicited amusement was the interaction, sometimes through dialogue, by the protagonist with the surrounding objects,
much better.
Persons,
Shake it, baby.
and Easter eggs.
That's one doomed space marine.
It really made you feel the cocky, machismo character Duke portrayed that every young boy wanted to be in the 90s.
I'm Duke Nukem, and I'm coming to get the rest of you alien bastards.
Graphics are going to play a big part in the next FPS we will cover, that came out later in the same year. Quake, developed by familiar group Ait'sZ Software and published by GT Interactive, has implemented a better resolution of full real-time 3D rendering graphics, meaning that it was no longer using the 2D sprites that FPS commonly used before, excluding Descent, which was the first. Views at any angle felt smooth and realistic while moving for its time, despite not having interpolation. Particles of flesh that burst from the monsters made it feel very lively. The enemies are seen as fully polygonal models, and the graphics support 3D acceleration using the GPU coming from the graphics card. And graphics and visuals are almost essential to be top-notch for an FPS, because when we talk about this genre, it is essentially a simulation of the player's perspective. So every bit of visual detail counts to help maximize gameplay and overall tone. The keyboard and mouse combo was altered for more of a modern feel. Although mouse aiming is not defaulted in this game, it is possible to activate it by opening the Quake console and typing in a command and disabling look strafe in the setting menu. Physics are more visibly present, seen with knockback on explosives, which players have manipulated to create the rocket jump to allow you to reach unbelievable measures of height. Jumping can also be increased by the higher level of velocity you reach. In other words, running and jumping at the same time, known as bunny hopping. It is a great technique to aid you in moving to areas swiftly. The Quake multiplayer was a staple and has revolutionized the online gameplay for the FPS. You are easily capable of setting up a server of up to 8 players. You can either play the single player in co-op mode or duel each other in many types of games, the most notably popular being death matches of either free-for-all or team. Multiplayer was serious that clans were established, and members were only allowed to play on the same team as each other, or risk being booted out of the group. All of this well-earned hype has cemented Quake the right to be the first game to be played as an esport ever. The music was a mix between rock, coming from the band called 9 Inch Nails, and some creepy, eerie, and disturbing ambient sounds that added to the already tense mood. Though it may seem that there hasn't been many new FPS features introduced, that statement is partially true, but it has refined previous FPS elements such as enemy balancing to make overall difficulty levels reasonable. Single-player environment has expanded to include more traps, secrets, and platforming. And finally, the well-executed multiplayer that has forever been engraved as a must for future FPS.
The original Quake was the very first game that allowed dedicated independent servers to exist that people could connect into.
Does this not remind you of the same impact that StarCraft had to the RTS? And not only was this game a financial and critical success, selling over 1 million copies by 1997, it was an FPS developer's standard rubric, and in one shape or form, most FPS game engines released after Quake have derived from it. Moving along to our last FPS of this pioneer era is one that was introduced as our first to be played on the console, N64 in particular. 007 GoldenEye, which was developed by Rare Limited and published by Nintendo, is based off the successful movie with the same name. You are to control a double agent by the name of James Bond who is set out to destroy an enemy satellite in the possession of the Soviets that will destroy any target on Earth they choose, called the GoldenEye. It wasn't the first FPS to be ported on the console, as that honor goes to Wolfenstein, but it was one of the earliest to be developed exclusively for it, and is one to remember for its vast implemented FPS features. The controls, which are a major point of emphasis when it comes to flaws due to the N64 controller, as you are probably aware, had to have been the most difficult to use with all the buttons placed in an unnatural layout. At times it was hard to press more than one button at once, or at least shift your thumb or fingers fast enough. And by far the most frustrating had to be the uncomfortable, not durable, and not very responsive analog. Reconfiguring the keys to a modern day controller was slightly difficult, but still managed to work. Aiming that we have introduced in the last few FPS is present, but seems to have reversed an innovation where it is only used while immobile, which is disappointing, especially when the auto aim does not sense the enemy accurately at times. Now getting into the new FPS aspects. Stealth is introduced and it is affected by the level of noise each weapon creates when shot. The louder the noise the weapon makes, the more enemies respawn and search the area. Using a silencer had minimal consequence in this case. Another stealth feature was the bonus damage done to the enemy when attacking them from behind. It was great to use the melee weapons in this case, as it was an instant kill costing no ammo, which can be scarce depending on the difficulty you decide to enroll in. Scoping has now been introduced with rifle weapons, and to the highest level was a sniper rifle, also important to the stealth feature for inflicting damage or instantly killing enemies while keeping your position distant and covert. It had a slight realistic feel when scoping from far, as the aiming was wobbly to signify the natural unsteady grip of a human. Dual wielding is now present but used rarely, as you can only dual wield the exact same type of weapons. It can solely be activated once you kill an enemy that possesses dual wielded weapons, and pick those same weapons up, which goes back to the earlier point, rare that it occurs. To touch further on the level of damage done to enemies, it is dependent on the area of the body the projectile hits. For example, headshots are the most lethal, whereas successful shots to the extremities such as arms and legs inflict the lowest level of damage. There are no health recovery items, but armor is obtainable and its availability is dependent on the difficulty level. The higher the difficulty, the more damage the enemies cause and can withstand, which is nothing new to the FPS. But now raising the difficulty also includes additional objectives. Our primary objective in all previous RTS was to survive while killing aggressive enemies using the discovered weapons and tools to further protect you. Now in GoldenEye it has taken this a step further by adding mission objectives which need to be met in order to fully complete the level. There is usually one or more objectives, and if you fail one of the objectives you are still able to proceed with the rest of the mission, but you will be notified in the mission recap of your failure. Completing missions on Agent and Secret Agent difficulty will allow you to complete the main plot. The highest level 00 Agent will unlock bonus features such as cheats, modes, secret weapons, and levels. The multiplayer was limited to just split-screen deathmatches of up to 4 players, but it was still entertaining. There were different parameters such as you only live twice, one-hit KOs, team battles, and more. Some maps come directly from the missions, and others are new for you to explore and understand the terrain to help you in. The sound quality was improved and the shot firing sounded much more realistic and unique for each of the 20 weapons. Which was an extensive amount for an FPS during this time. The music was also an outstanding choice of high-quality genreless upbeats. But it was perfect for the stealth theme of anticipation. Currently, GoldenEye has sold more than 8 million units, making it Nintendo 64's third bestseller behind juggernaut titles such as Mario 64 and Mario Kart. Though I do have to say this game has not aged well, and part of that reason we already covered with the controls, but also the camera angles, which are essential for an FPS to be precise and adaptive. And not to strictly point the finger at this game, this is highly common with N64, and especially early 3D games. And because of this, a remaster of this FPS would be appreciated by most, as it is also a timeless masterpiece like that of Doom and Quake. And so ends the era of the pioneers that attributed the basic principles of an FPS. They are often labeled as primitive, outdated, and hard on the eyes for lack of visual detail. But in every timeline it is important to see where it all began, and appreciate the development of new features that ease gameplay. Rechargeable health, better camera views, and graphics themselves will have the biggest leap on this next era that I will cover. This era will be called the FPS boom, the time frame where the FPS rose in popularity and claimed the hearts of most gamers. These upcoming FPS have expanded their reach to the console, where developers have used the success of GoldenEye as an example to rise with the consumer demand. On top of showing these major leaps for the FPS, we will thoroughly investigate the reason behind its rise in this specific time frame. So what are your thoughts on these FPS that pioneered the genre? Did you enjoy any of these games? Of course I missed some, and there are only so many that can be covered, and just so you're aware, this is not a ranking of FPS. Also, if you have noticed, I did change the format of the timeline videos to shorten the details of each game, so I can cover more to try to ensure I don't miss any of the ones you enjoyed playing. I will take a bit of a hiatus from the FPS timeline, and will work on a few RTS videos that have been highly requested I cover. Once I have completed these videos, I will resume with the FPS timeline of the boom era. Lastly, I really want to give a big thank you for all the recent support, through the comments, liking, subscribing, and even simply just watching. I really did not expect these videos to have this deep of a popularity. I also do appreciate your patience as I'm still new with content creation and I know I've made some mistakes, so bear with me and enjoy the ride. Once again, if you enjoyed the video at all, CLS please. Thank you and have a splendid day.